Um, Maybe without further ado, I'll just start with some of my introductory remarks. My name is Annie Kokobobo. I am chair of the Department of Slavic Languages, Slavic and Eurasian Languages and Literature. So we have very recently changed our name, and for the better. And also interim director for the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at KU, and that's just for this fall. And, you know, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this lecture series titled very loosely Russia and Race. This had been a conference that we had wanted to organize in the spring. However, events with the pandemic made that very difficult. So we are now transitioning to a lecture series format, which, you know, I think has given us more opportunity in a way to bring in people from all over and bring them together, bring together an interdisciplinary, I would say, group of people. And I want to just screen share real quick with you our kind of general poster. This is our lineup of talks this fall, and we're starting today with Jonathan Flatley and his talk, Our Friend Angela, the Black Communist Star. But before I start, and I'll leave this on the screen, but before I turn over to Jonathan, we have a couple of preliminary remarks to sort of launch the series, and we hope to continue the series into the next semester, and perhaps indefinitely. And the reason for that is that, you know, race is not a topic we talk about very often in our field, and by field I mean generally, you know, the study of Russia, any kind of interdisciplinary, particularly in literary studies, we don't talk about it very much. And in general, you know, I think the discussion of the topic hasn't been particularly centered. You know, even when it's talked about sort of piecemeal. And, you know, even before events of this summer and the, you know, incidences of police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, this had been a topic that had been really important for us to address. So, you know, I think the summer only adds to that urgency. And so we're all here. And I think, you know, I'm really excited to learn. I think race is a subject that, you know, in a lot of legal and various discourses in Russia is not addressed directly, but it is, you know, profoundly important, I think, perhaps for that very reason. And so I'm really excited to be here and to have all these speakers. And I think for our field in particular, it's really important to sort of center this discussion and to learn and to develop these conversations, in part because, you know, we don't have very many people of color in our field. And I think one of the ways in which we can become more inviting, we become more inclusive, is to continue to have these conversations and to make our field relevant. And that is really important to me as a scholar. I think it's really important to a number of people. And this is kind of how I start that growth and that process is by having these lectures, by learning and continuing to center this conversation. The Russia and Race lecture series is our, you know, one and only lecture series this year. So, and that is very intentional. And so I'm grateful also that here we have Tamara Falkov, who's Associate Dean for the Humanities in our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And she will make some remarks in a moment, but I'm grateful for her presence here, but also for the support, the financial support and support we've gotten from the college, co-sponsorship, and also the Department of African American Studies has co-sponsored this lecture series, the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Languages and Literatures, and also the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, in part with funds from the U.S.-Russia Foundation. And it's a grant that we got that is going toward the lecture series. So without further ado, I will now introduce Dr. Tamara Falkov, who will make some brief remarks as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Annie, and welcome, Jonathan, to be part of this wonderful series. I'm really excited to be a part of it. When Annie told me about the theme, I was thinking about just a few comments I wanted to make that relate to my life. So I'm going to say some personal things which aren't typically what you hear at the beginning of a conference. But I'm a Latin Americanist and a film studies scholar, and first of all, in terms of thinking about radical political figures like Angela Davis, who found refuge and support in the Soviet Union, that definitely relates to my interest in the tricontinental, transnationalist work that socialist filmmakers in countries like Cuba created, where they made some very strong solidarity bonds with countries that were trying to foment revolution. And so to have someone like Angela Davis make a bond with the Soviet Union, that was something that I wanted to explore further in terms of Latin American and Third World solidarity movements. And so just briefly, in Cuba, which was such a nexus for this kind of a movement, there was a documentary filmmaker named Santiago Alvarez, and he was very much looking at the civil rights movement in the United States. And he was seeing the treatment of African Americans in the civil rights movement, and took photographs from Life magazine where people are being brutalized. And he created a very powerful 6-minute documentary called Now that you can get on YouTube. And I highly recommend you look at it, because what he does is he overlays Lena Horne, a very famous singer here in the US, singing a song called Now, which is to the tune of Hava Nagila, which is a Hebrew hymn. And I mentioned the Jewish angle because I'm going to talk about that topic in a minute. And the point I'm trying to make is that Cuba, even though it was in the Cold War and had a bond with the Soviet Union, was definitely in solidarity with the civil rights movement in the US. And if you ever go to Havana, there is a Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Center, which seems to be very unusual and surprising given the Cold War situation we had with Cuba. So I just wanted to add that in, that we don't often see these other bonds and connections because of the fact that we're in the United States and we have oftentimes only one version of history. The other thing I want to say to Annie's comments about race in Russia is that I'm always appreciative of scholars like Annie who looks, for example, at gender and other topics to be more inclusive in terms of how we think about Russia or the Soviet Union. And when I learned about this series, I see Vitaly Chernetsky's here. I've been working with him because my family had to flee the pogroms in Russia when my grandmother was a teen, and she fled because, people were being shot in front of her, and it was, this typical story of pogroms and the diaspora. My family actually immigrated to Argentina, so I know much more about my Argentine background because my parents were born there and then came here. I always thought I was Russian Jewish, and I had to say Jewish. I couldn't just say I'm Russian, because in the Soviet Union, the passports would mark you as Jewish. That was your nationality. You were not Russian. And so as much as that's not about race per se, it's about exclusion. And so working with Vitaly and learning more, it turns out I'm actually Ukrainian. And so I'm exploring that. So any more information I can learn about the kind of nuanced politics of race and other marginalized identities in the region is very much welcome. So without further ado, I'd love to have Annie introduce Dr. Jonathan Flatley. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Tamara, and thank you for sharing those personal details. This is really fascinating. And I think, to your point, part of what's so interesting, I think, about race in Russia is that it's often embedded in other categories like ethnicity. So I think it'll be interesting to explore that further in the series. But I'm very pleased that we're starting this series with Dr. Jonathan Flatley, who was meant to be our keynote speaker when this would have been a conference. And so now he's our lead speaker in the series. And Jonathan Flatley is a professor of English at Wayne State University. He's the author of Affective Mapping, Melancholia and the Politics of Modernism, that dates to 2008, as well as Like Andy Warhol, a book that dates to 2017. He's currently working on two separate books, one titled Black Leninism and the other about reading for mood. And so without further ado, I invite you to hear Dr. Flatley's talk, and it's titled again, Our Friend Angela, the Black Communist Star. Jonathan.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation and for the technical assistance. I will warn you now that it's possible that my internet connection will become unstable, as they say, and so I uploaded, or Ani rather uploaded my paper into a Google Doc, where you can like follow along or whatever. This is a draft; it's a work in progress. So, you know, keep that in mind. But in case my voice gets wobbly or you miss sections, you can look at that. You know, I wanted to just say two other things by way of preface. One is, you know, I'm very much, it feels weird to be doing this because I'm still very much in the space of grief after the death of Robert Byrd, which, you know, was just a couple days ago, and he was a close colleague, and he was also very, you know, committed to thinking about race in Russia. So, you know, anyway, I don't know. I just want to mark that loss and the degree to which I just feel diminished by grief today. The other thing is that, you know, I wrote the draft of this paper, you know, I don't know, like a year ago or 8 months ago or something like that, that I haven't really changed that much, even though it needs a lot of work. But my thinking about it has been changed a lot by this summer of protests, and also just by the evident resurgence of racism and xenophobia around the world, kind of whatever nation you turn to, it seems there's a resurgence in racism. And in that context, it's interesting to recall that the Soviet Union's official, you know, policy, official ideology was anti-racist and anti-xenophobic, with all of its contradictions and failures, but nonetheless with real consequences. And it's interesting to kind of think about, okay, what would that, you know, what would it look like for there to be a state that was doing that kind of anti-racist, anti-xenophobic work as part of its project? And we see, you know, in part what that looks like. It changes the geopolitical terrain and the meaning of racism, I think, in a not insignificant way. So, all of that said, I will start. Anyway, this will all come back, and I'd be happy to sort of talk about, you know, the current moment in relation to this past moment, you know, afterwards. I think, you know, I'm timing myself here. I've already been rambling for like 3 minutes. It's like a 20-page document, so I think it should take me about, you know, I don't know, 40, 45 minutes. So I'm going to share the screen now. I have a bunch of images. Bear with me while I figure out the technology here. Okay, I'm sharing, and let's see if we can do slideshow. Okay. In 2002, legendary performer and artist Vaginal Davis, seen here. Sorry, this is not what I want. I want full screen rather than slideshow. Legendary performer and artist Vaginal Davis, seen here adorning the cover of Jose Munoz's classic queer theory text Disidentifications, wrote about changing her name. I was 16. This is Vag. I was 16 when I decided to change my name to Vaginal Davis in sexual homage to Angela Davis. I was studying film through a program for disadvantaged youth with Los Angeles Film Exposition, or Film X as it was called at the time, after seeing Angela Davis in a bootlegged copy of the Soviet documentary Our Friend Angela, where she visits the Soviet Union and is presented with flowers, awards, and a tiara that keeps falling out of her giant afro. After that, I became mesmerized by her image and had to read everything about her. It was very naive and petulant of my ween-age self to declare myself a Marxist, and on top of that, a self-proclaimed communist leader. Did I have any followers? No, just a strong and abiding need to fashion my own myths. I figured if communism was good enough for Angela, it was good enough for me. Vaginal Davis's self-fashioning, or self-fabulation, to borrow from Mark Siegel and Tavia Nyong'o, here is mimetic. Like the drag queens described in Esther Newton's classic Mother Camp, Davis is here modeling herself after a mass media image of a glamorous woman. Indeed, who was more glamorous than Angela Davis? There we go. But where the already publicly recognized glamour that served as a model for the drag queens that Newton discusses were usually movie or pop stars like Marilyn Monroe or Diana Ross, Angela Davis was famous, first of all, as an outlaw. You'll remember that Angela Davis had been charged with murder and kidnapping and put on the FBI's most wanted fugitive list because guns she had purchased legally were used by her young friend Jonathan Jackson in a doomed effort to free his brother George Jackson, one of the Soledad brothers and Davis's friend, during a trial during which a judge was killed. To be sure, as Warhol had pointed out earlier in the 1964 Most Wanted Men series, this was also a kind of celebrity, one that indeed could reference a kind of wanting, especially for those whose desires, like Warhol's, were themselves criminal. For Vaginal Davis, who to be sure is no stranger to outlaw desire, a self-labeled sexual repulsive and proponent of terrorist drag, one that seeks to disrupt, as it says on her website, the cultural assimilation of gay-oriented and corporate-friendly drag. For her, Angela Davis is not a mesmerizing object of sexual homage primarily as an outlaw, but rather as a Black communist. In fact, we can probably say that she's the most famous Black communist ever, and she's famous not in small part because of the Soviet Union. Vaginal Davis is not mesmerized by the image of Angela Davis as a commodified Hollywood star either, but as the feted hero of the people in this movie, Our Friend Angela, or Nаш Друг Анджела. In fact, after her arrest and during her trial, Angela Davis, who'd become a member of the Communist Party in 1968, had become the center of an unprecedented global campaign to free her. It was a massive campaign in the United States with wide participation from a range of left and Black groups. The Black Panthers, with whom Davis had an ambivalent relation at that point, after she had joined the Communist Party, campaigned for her freedom. You can see that in the earlier image that I showed. You know, Aretha Franklin offers to bail her out. John Lennon, the Rolling Stones write songs about her. Jane Fonda visits her in jail. She's a huge celebrity, but probably most consequential in terms of geopolitical force, but also the sheer number of people brought in contact with the image and story of Angela Davis is the massive Soviet-led publicity effort on her behalf. One might reasonably suggest even that for a moment she was the most famous person in the world. After she's arrested in 1970, Davis was celebrated in the Soviet Union as a courageous American patriot, fighting for equal rights for Black people, and as an American communist. Meredith Roman points out that the Free Angela campaign was the first time that Soviet authorities had called upon citizens to protest the potential execution, right, she was facing the death penalty, of an African-American comrade since the Scottsboro trials of the 1930s. Here's a poster, Freedom to the Scottsboro prisoners. Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, had written a widely publicized letter that invoked the rhetoric of legal lynching. The Soviet press, Roman writes, emphasized that beyond the borders of the USSR, the Free Angela campaign mobilized millions across Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the rest of Europe on behalf of the courageous American. Several newsreel-type films were made about her arrest as an instance of American racism. Perhaps most affecting, and I'll show some images from those in a little bit. Perhaps most affecting, there was in addition a campaign involving letters, cards, drawings, petitions, posters, and banners signed by workers and students. Here I'm showing a series of letters and drawings from East German school children, which are in the CPUSA archives at the Tamiment archive housed at NYU. Here we have, there's all these cards, drawings. It's flowers for Angela. And here we have a banner signed by school children. So of a particular elementary school. And I'll return to think more about these in a moment. So these campaigns, they appeared to affect her trial. It put pressure on the prosecutors, on the judge, indeed on every aspect of her trial and imprisonment, since, as Angela Davis wrote in her autobiography, any unjustified attack on me could be exposed. Any unjustified attack on me could be exposed. So for instance, when she reports being mistreated in jail to her friends and lawyers, and they share the news, in a matter of hours, telegrams and telephone calls began to pour into the sheriff's office. When the judge makes the somewhat surprising decision to let her out on bail, even the judge remarks on the mail I've received over the last 2 days and the telephone calls, none of which I've personally taken, but which my staff has taken from a tremendous number of states, and telegrams from foreign countries. It's a case of amazing interest. And, in an interview that she did while she was in jail, she said that she got 100 to 400 letters a day, at least half of them originating from abroad. And she singles out the East German letters as being especially moving. So the film Our Friend Angela is made to document Angela Davis's victory tour of the Soviet Union after she's acquitted. And the moment that Vaginal Davis mentions takes place when she's visiting Uzbekistan. She's met with school children sitting in a class. Here are images from that film, and she's received an Uzbek ethnic cap as a gift. Here are images from the film. There she is in the school. She sort of does a tour of like classic sites. And so I have to switch. Let me see if I can. I have to switch. I'm going to stop sharing, reappear for a moment, start sharing again, and see if I can share the clip. It doesn't want to share, so I'm going to share the desktop. I'm going to share computer sound. So this is like I'm at the archives, and this is a clip that I took while I was at the archives outside Moscow, like watching these films. There's an English DVD. Or DVD in English that is what Vaginal probably watched, but the file, I can't share it on Zoom. because that would violate like copyright for this Soviet film somehow. So, or it's probably it's in the Apple software or something. Anyway, so this is very poor quality. But let me just read you in English beforehand the. Well, I'll read it afterwards. You can watch it, and then I'll tell you what how they translate it in the English version.
Не беда, если узбекская тюбетейка не держится на такой шапке. Главное, подарок от чистого сердца.
Sorry, my inexperience with the crucial moment is she's trying to put on the cap and it won't stay on. There she is trying to keep it on. It won't stay on. Here's how they translate the commentary in English. The Uzbek skull cap is too small for such a thick shock of hair, but the thing that matters is that this is a gift straight from the heart. Okay, so let me then actually I can stay on that for a minute and then I'll skip back to the other images. So you'll notice that this is not a tiara, as Vaginal Davis remembered, that's falling off her afro, but a small hat. This is a well-established Soviet ritual that originates, I think, with Stalin, what Samuel Hodgkin described as a kind of ethnic drag. He's done work on this. His dissertation is about Tajikistan, or a chapter of it is about sort of Tajik ethnic drag. Where the stereotypical costume of a given nationality is donned in order to indicate Soviet affirmation of national forms. In turning the cap into a tiara, Vaginal Davis has emphasized the way that there is something regal about the way that Davis is treated here. She's a black communist leader, recognized by the Soviet state, feted with flowers, a figure not only of mass media attention, but geopolitical significance and power. To see a young black woman with what Angela Davis most often referred to as a natural, it was not yet commodified. She writes that it was still oppositional. She writes that my natural hairstyle in those days, still a rarity, identified me as a sympathizer with the Black Power movement. Celebrated as a hero of the people, these images were attractive, at least in part, because they indicated by way of negation what was missing. That is, what was impossible in the United States. That is, a black person being recognized by state power, by a massively powerful state government, something, of course, the US government couldn't and would not do. Here was a state, the Soviet Union, that actually valued, in the language that the state speaks of rituals, awards, speeches, invitations, meetings, the lives, the courage, the accomplishments of black people. So here I'm going to go back to this. I'll try to go to full screen. So our friend Angela, it cheerily and straightforwardly documents Davis's trip to the Soviet Union, including her arrival. There's that welcome to the Soviet Union image. Her meeting with various dignitaries, including Tereshkova, her reception of various honorary degrees, her address to various audiences of students and workers, her travel around the Soviet Union, and her viewing of sites commemorating the revolution. She lays flowers at Lenin's tomb. She visits the school in Tashkent. She sits next to these children there. And on the one hand, her speech and her performance at all these sites correspond exactly to the requirements. She's performing rituals of state power. Her speeches are recitations of what would have been, to Soviet ears, very familiar ideological language. The film also interestingly makes the connection between Davis and Soviet feminism, especially the feminism of non-white students studying in Moscow and the non-white women in Tashkent. The film focuses repeatedly on interested and impressed non-white audience members. And part of the point here seems to be that the Soviet Union is not itself is not itself white, even as that assertion, as we know, is an effort to disavow less official Soviet and Russian racism. And there had been, not long before this, several attacks on African students in Moscow that actually also received some publicity. But what Vag seizes on here is the moment of the hat, aka the tiara, falling off her giant afro. It's a moment, that is, where Davis cannot seamlessly fit into this official role, a role which at that moment itself involves a kind of overt acting like somebody else, fitting into another role in a way that's meant to be overtly artificial. And it's because of her hair, it's because of her black hair that literally can't fit into the hat. That is, and I think there's a lot more to say about this, and I'll, I'm hoping that you'll have many insights to share with me about this moment. That is, but it's quite a complicated moment, because the misfitting is one that draws attention to and derails this moment of what Hodgkin calls ethnic drag. In being asked to copy what would have usually been white Russians, although not exclusively, taking on ethnic garb in an effort to ritualistically or even fetishistically affirm an ethnic form, with its whole own interesting history, Davis doesn't refuse to do that task. She's smiling, she's sort of giggling, and she's laughing about it, so much as she fails to do it. Her hair prevents her from imitating an act of ethnic appropriation. It is as if failed imitation, and so to go back to, and this is the moment that Vag Davis focuses on. It's interesting that it's as if failed imitation is more interesting than successful imitation, that this moment says. Or it's as if her hair, her formidable sense of style, is itself asserting an agency, one that cautions viewers to attend to the complexity of imitations across racial, ethnic, and national lines. In the context of the film as a whole, the misfitting seems minor, one that doesn't really feel like it contradicts her ideological function. It's kind of charming not least because it allows the audience a chance to laugh a little, to laugh about the whole series of events, maybe to recognize that the whole thing has been a kind of performance. Angela Davis acting like a sort of official Soviet personage, playing the official role, a moment of recognizing the kind of ridiculousness of the whole thing, and the contingency and the particularity of Davis as a person with a history and a body and a way of being in the world that intrudes into this official performance. That afro was then and subsequently became, of course, the chief element of her celebrity image, but it was not quite representable, this moment seems to say, within the available idioms, Soviet idioms or genres of style, which is of course what made it so compelling. And this historian Maxim Matusevich told this story like on Facebook or whatever. He writes these sort of very compelling personal stories about how his mother, who was Jewish, really wanted to have a hairstyle like Angela Davis. And I think there's a whole series of efforts to imitate Angela Davis in the Soviet context, or with varying degrees of racism or acknowledgement of the difficulty of that imitation. But that afro at that moment, I think to Americans, but also to Soviet audiences, signaled the possibility of an elsewhere, some other not yet represented way of being. And the friends that she's traveling with also have naturals. So it's worth noting that they all arrived with this in this mode. So, but it's not surprising that Vaginal Davis, whose self-avowed vocation is a practitioner of terrorist drag, she's a punk rock star, her whole sort of career has been about not fitting in, and not fitting in not infrequently because of her queer Black body. So it's not surprising that she focuses on this moment of misfitting, and where misfitting doesn't produce stigma or disapproval, but actually draws attention to this most attention-grabbing element of Davis's appearance, which only heightens her capacity to function as a powerful Black woman. This then is the moment that leads Vaginal Davis not only to rename herself in mesmerized sexual homage, as she puts it, but also to declare, after some demurrals about her youth and arrogance, that if communism was good enough for Angela Davis, then it's good enough for me. Now, by way of this introduction, what I'm trying to get at here, the thing I'm trying to think about in this paper is, by way of Vaginal Davis's theorization of Angela Davis's celebrity, what I'm trying to think about is the relationship between Angela Davis's communism, indeed her Leninism, and her celebrity, a quite specific Soviet celebrity, or one that's mediated by the mechanisms of Soviet mass publicity. In this instance, inasmuch as it's through fan identification with Angela Davis that Vaginal Davis declares herself a communist, we might say that being a star is in fact an effective mechanism of communist organizing. But celebrity was not usually central to the Black Leninist or the Black radical tradition's emphasis on Black group formation. More important were collective aesthetic practices, music, protest, newspapers, strikes, and the like. How, I want to ask, does this moment, does the case of Angela Davis, this particular moment in Angela Davis's career, fit in with this long tradition in the US of Black Leninism? While publicity, of course, was tremendously important to that tradition, the newspaper played a key role there, as I mentioned, and charisma and oratory, of course, as always, play a significant role in political organizing. It was not usually central to the emphasis on Black group formation. So, and this is the sort of meta question that I'm trying to pose here, to which I really do not have an answer. What role does fame play? What role can it play? What role might it play in Black group formation? Those moments when Black people come together as a group for whom collective action seems urgent, obvious, and vital, and when victory over the forces of white supremacy seems possible. The task of making such groups, along with the closely related one of thinking through and reflecting on how such groups are created, constitutes a central problem for modern Black thought and cultural production. And I think it's one that Davis herself is also centrally preoccupied with, and this speaks directly to the current moment. There's not really, there's no leader, there's no celebrity figure organizing the protests that have taken place around the country, right? They've been more or less spontaneous, self-organized mass movements, each of which has taken on its own particular character in different cities. So it's, but does there need to be a leader? Does there need to be a celebrity organizing this? Is fame, how would that change the formula here? Or change the outcome, or change the nature of the organizing. Part of the aim is it's a sort of bigger question about the role that Soviet anti-racism played, which was mostly towards Soviet audiences. Later in the 60s, it was maybe directed towards audiences. But my internet is unstable. My internet is unstable. Is it coming back? Is it coming back? This is a moment where when the Soviet Union in the 60s was interested in sort of, intervening in Africa and in Southeast Asia and in Latin America. And so international propaganda was important at that moment, but earlier it's mostly towards an internal audience. And so the question is, what effect does that have on Black people's capacity in the U.S. to produce politically powerful groups? Does it have a consequence? Of course, there's material aid. The Soviet Union is actually helping, hiring the lawyer to get this to free the Scottsboro boys. But does it, what other effects does it have? It changes the geopolitics of racism and anti-racism. JFK apparently was, had a special office in the White House that was just paying attention to how Pravda was like covering, Bull Connor's dogs attacking Black protesters. So that's there's a sort of longer context for this question about Davis. But in the case of Davis, we can really say that, not only were Lenin's writings themselves important to her thinking about revolutionary organization, but also Soviet publicity made her famous and got her out of jail. How did this fit in with her own sense of her political project? And to address that, I think it makes sense to go back to a minute to her autobiography, and which is a fantastic text. There's these funny moments where where she's giving speeches where these people pop up. Like, who is this guy? This guy, who kind of looks like a plant. He's like, is he a KGB who arrives with this sort of printed sign that says glory to the Soviet Union or whatever, glory to the USSR, with, these pre-prepared signs. We are greeting Angela Davis. So I'll leave it with that for a minute. So anyway, it's worth sort of going back to this moment where she talks about joining the Communist Party. So it's after the riots in Watts in '65. There's a new Black militancy that's coming into being under the rubric of Black Power. She's so excited by this, she comes back to the States. She'd been she was in Frankfurt, studying with Adorno. She comes back to the States and switches from Adorno to Marcuse. She's only going to work with members of the Frankfurt School. She's working with Marcuse in San Diego, and she gets involved with the Black Power movement in Southern California, especially in LA. And she's involved in a number of different groups, including the Panthers. And she suffers a bout of political depression. It sort of peaks at the beginning of 1968. She writes, as 1968 got underway, I realized how much I needed to find a collective. Floating from activity to activity was no revolutionary anything. Individual activity, sporadic and disconnected, is not revolutionary work. Feeling this lack of a collective, the essential revolutionary problem, the one the Leninist Party is designed to solve, is me now. She starts to consider joining the party. During that depressing time, she writes, I reread Lenin's What Is to Be Done, and it helped me to clarify my own predicament. I read Du Bois again, particularly his statements around the time that he decided to join the Communist Party. And she's clear about what she wants from a political movement. I wanted an anchor, a base, a mooring. I needed comrades with whom I could share a common ideology. I was tired of ephemeral ad hoc groups that fell apart when faced with the slightest difficulty. This is her experience of these groups in the last couple of years. Moreover, these groups were characterized too often by misogyny. This is me now. She's sort of complaining about how these the women do all the work and the men claim all the credit. Perhaps most of all, though, she wants to win. She wants to defeat racism and capitalism. She wants to be part of a confident collectivity where, as she writes, confrontations were opportunities to be met, where there were structures and approaches to meet the various challenges instead of irresolution, inconsistency, and ineffectiveness. So the Communist Party had just run a black woman, Charlene Mitchell, for president. Davis was impressed by what she had seen of the communists in Southern California, including her friends Franklin and Kendra Alexander. And in July 1968, she writes, I turned over my 50 cents, the initial membership dues, to the chairman of the Che Lumumba Club, and became a full-fledged member of the Communist Party USA. And so it was then, as a member, there's more to think about there and more to, but this gives you the basic contours of how she was thinking about joining the party. And it was then as a member of the party that Davis was then defended by the whole party apparatus after she's arrested. So she self-consciously is following in the footsteps of W.E.B. Du Bois, who had joined the party several years earlier in 1961. It's a funny choice, or it's a wayward choice. It was a bit unexpected, as it was when Du Bois joined, and it was sort of like puzzling to other Black leftists and Black Marxists. Du Bois joins not long after the revelations about Stalin's campaign of violence against his own people, and as von Raspberry points out, Aimé Césaire, by contrast, at this moment, maintained his anti-colonial, anti-capitalist politics, but openly critiques the Soviet Union as a state. In '68, after all, around the world, it was not Stalin that was the chief political context, but the Soviet repression in Czechoslovakia. So, Davis decides to join the party in '68, and like a month later, the tanks roll into Prague, right? So the timing is unfortunate, as it were. So, and it's worth noting that the Black Panthers, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, other Black Marxist groups in the United States openly also engaged with Lenin, were not interested in forming ties with the communist with the Communist Party or the Soviet Union. So Davis is going in a separate direction there, and so. I want to sort of think about this for a moment, because I think it has to do with the nature of her celebrity at this moment, and that is, what's the Soviet context for her reception? Sort of peak Brezhnev, right? And it's not at this moment in 1972 when she visits the Soviet Union that Soviet citizens didn't still believe in socialism. This is what Alexei Yurchak argues in his famous book, but that they saw the Soviet government itself was not living up to its own socialist ideals. So it might be great that they helped to liberate Angela Davis, who'd been wrongfully imprisoned, and to feel like as citizens they participated in that just by sort of being part of the Soviet project. But that didn't necessarily translate into a positive reception of Davis when she went to the Soviet Union. So you can take, for instance, this film, Pionernaya Number 11. It's like the pioneer, the sort of, club for communist kids, the sort of party for kids. They had a TV show that, or like a newsreel. From 1971, where we see footage of news coverage demanding Davis's freedom, and Davis's sister Fania making a trip to Moscow and collecting cards and petitions supporting Davis. In the logic of the news, this story appears alongside a series of other reports about the building of a new ship, a Ukrainian national school costume drawing celebration, a story about a pensioner, a grandfather who carves wooden toys, and another story that's basically about cute animals. A newsreel, sorry, I don't have clips, I don't have screenshots from that Pionernaya, or I have them, but that's not what you're seeing right now. What you're seeing right now is a newsreel that covers Davis's arrest and trial, which appears in the context of a series of short stories, including one about Brezhnev's successful achievement of friendship with Bangladesh, a Kurskaya factory which is exceeding the norm, an artist profile, the pursuit of women's rights in Chukotia, which serves to introduce a kind of thematic focus on women, which includes coverage of communist Angela Davis, and women soldiers fighting against the U.S. intervention in Vietnam. The story concludes with an assertion about women leading the battle against imperialism everywhere, and then transitions into a story about the circus. This is to say that the propaganda about Davis appears very much in an overall context of what Yurchak calls Soviet authoritative discourse. This, of course, sets a mood, a way of apprehending these reports about Davis, that is also characteristic of a slightly longer film from that moment, just called Free Angela Davis, which gives a depiction, and that's what I have here, which gives a depiction of Sorry, my images got mixed up here. Oh, here's Pia Naradine, number 11. Here's Freedom to Angela Davis. And, you know, Freedom to Angela Davis. There's like news reports. Here she is. This story kind of covers what, you know, fucked up racist things are happening in the U.S. George Wallace. Here's some screenshots from that, like poor children in the South. I'll go back to this, or I'll go back to Freedom for Angela Davis. You can sort of see these hands coming out of in between, you know, bars of a cell. You know, soldiers defending James Meredith as he attends college, like scenes from the civil rights movement. And it throughout there's this voice and toning in this kind of paternalistic voice. All of these things Angela Davis saw and knew. And it's this kind of, it's telling you how to feel. And it's this kind of, you're to pity her for, you know, but she knows the horror of being Black in the United States. And it ends with like Angela Davis's life is in danger, and we have to save her. So there's this movement back and forth between Angela Davis as this sort of heroic leader and images of abjection or sort of poverty, victimhood, which is typical of Soviet propaganda at this time. It's back and forth between victimhood and sort of the powerful revolutionary. In the book Vision and Communism, which was co-edited by Robert Byrd, Matthew Jesse Jackson argues that in depicting the pain of others, Soviet anti-racist posters sought to intrude into the visual sphere like an icon, offering a kind of dazzling otherness that impinges on the flow of everyday life. The aim was not so much to represent specific suffering of specific people, but to offer types that could do the work of presenting Western bounty as worthless because of the suffering it created, which in turn presented Soviet socialism as a tolerable alternative to capitalism's nightmare. So I'm at about 40 minutes here, and I have like 4.5 pages left, so I'm going a little over time, for which I apologize. So I'm trying to sort of describe like this sort of, how are these images received in the Soviet Union? What is this Soviet mode of publicity through which Angela Davis's images being promulgated? So in this sort of presentation of the Black American victim, insofar as this person is far away and not really affecting Soviet power in any way directly, it's not really a mechanism for creating international solidarity. That is in part because, as Jurčák discusses, there's a tension here or a split between the ideals of a political system as put forth in its ideological discourse and the reality of its ideological practices. So what you get, as Jurčák describes it, is an increasing distance between the rituals and practices of power from any actual referent. Voting or appearance at the parade or drawing cards for Angela Davis aren't necessarily felt to be linked up to the achievement of socialism. They're compulsory, but what's compulsory is their performance, which Jurčák notes doesn't require belief to produce effects. They're like performative speech acts. Their importance is in what they make happen, not in what they refer to. The actual ideological content seems kind of pasted on or floats alongside it. So what matters in her trip to the Soviet Union is her performing these rituals of state power according to the rules. Her utterance of the completely standard language seemed itself to contradict her image as someone who spoke truth to power, right? Here's this sort of problematic moment in her reception. This is not the same person who spoke out quite forcefully against the state, against the police, for political prisoners in the US. She spoke truth to US power, but not to Soviet power. And I think that definitely damaged her image in the Soviet Union and East Germany even more than it did in the US. And that sort of distanced relation to the image of Davis is underscored in a well-known song by the famous bard Vladimir Vysotsky, the song "The Victim of Television," where he sings of the enthusiasm for Angela Davis among the patients in an insane asylum. Right? It's like something you would do if you're crazy. So I want to just turn kind of in conclusion, as a way to conclude, back to these images from children, which seems to be kind of classic performative acts, right? Letters that students are, these are like school assignments, letters that children are compelled to write, and, what they might have hated writing, or they might have loved writing them, or been indifferent about. But they nonetheless achieved important effects, including influencing American government officials and Davis herself. And allowing East Germany to present itself internationally as a defender of civil rights and to successfully ally itself with Angela Davis herself. The people performing these acts, though, might have had quite divergent, contradictory, oppositional views about that performance. And, this is anecdotal, but a friend of mine, Susanna Saxa, who grew up in East Germany, remembers doing these drawings and feeling quite conflicted about it. On the one hand, she says, it felt somehow great to be part of a group that can be so strong as to free a person from prison. On the other hand, it was clearly a compulsory ideological drill, like so many others, and it was necessary to perform it, a necessity motivated by fear. She didn't want her family to be arrested. But when Davis came to the USSR and then to East Germany, she thought, why is this woman standing next to these ugly men from the government? And on TV, she saw the big euphoric welcoming of Angela in the GDR, and it was a completely staged event. Here she is with Honecker. She continues, it did not make any sense to me that this extremely smart woman did not give us any indication that she was not supportive of the rotten party system in the GDR, which was spoiling socialist ideals and imprisoning its people for not abiding with its ideology. Along with her shame for allowing the GDR to take away her enthusiasm for a woman who really was revolutionary, Susanna remarked that she also felt frustration about the impossibility of any kind of international revolutionary contact. And yet for Susanna, and for many others, I suspect, this initial contact with Davis, ambivalent as it may have been, may have also left what Jan Radway called, in another context about her own reading experiences, a heretofore undetected sediment, a silt of desires, preferences, and tastes, something like what Michel Foucault called the stigmata of experience. Marks both on and in a sentient body that forever after bears within it the capacity to respond, to react as that first act of marking has called forth. Susanna, herself a communist writer, performer, actor, and not incidentally part of the same collective, Cheap, with Vaginal Davis, with whom I started out, ends her email to me describing her relation to these images by saying, "Today I would love to paint roses and sunflowers for Angela Davis." Davis's Soviet fame, for which participation in the rituals of power is a requirement, is a blockage to this revolutionary contact, at least in these state environments. In Cuba, which you heard about earlier, or in Egypt, it might be a different story. And I think Davis herself was aware of this problem. She herself was quite ambivalent about her fame and wrote in her autobiography again and again that she wanted to see herself, she was writing this book to be an example. She was writing this book in order to get other people interested in communism and in fighting against racism and political prisoners. Every time the slogan was offered "Free Angela Davis," she said, no, look, it has to be "Free Angela Davis" and "Free all political prisoners." She was also quite ambivalent about becoming famous for her hair. And she wrote a piece in 1994 in Critical Inquiry that it's both humiliating and humbling to discover that a single generation after the events that constructed me as a public personality, I'm remembered as a hairdo. It's humiliating because it reduces a politics of liberation to a politics of fashion. It's humbling because such encounters with the younger generation demonstrate the fragility and mutability of historical images, particularly those associated with African American history. Now I'm finally finishing. Angela Davis's decision to join the Communist Party might be seen as a kind of wayward act, along the lines brilliantly traced out by Saidiya Hartman, who writes that waywardness articulates the paradox of cramped creation, the entanglement of escape and confinement, flight and captivity. It is to love what is not loved. It is a refusal of any of the options left. And given the constraints the Soviet government created for freedom and political action, this is me now, it was both escape and entanglement, to be sure. Yet I think Davis's joining of the party must also be seen as an effort to resist being wayward, or at least to turn waywardness itself into a specific path, one that is made out of a sense of frustration with what Saidiya Hartman calls the errant path taken by a leaderless swarm in search of a better place than here. How she describes waywardness. Angela Davis's gambit was that to find a better place than here, it was necessary to have a plan, to have an analysis of the situation, and above all, to be part of a collectivity that was not a leaderless swarm, but a self-conscious collective, committed to fighting white supremacy and hopeful of victory. Of course, hope, as Ernst Bloch put it, and as Jose Munoz emphasized, is in the realm of the not yet. Because it's open-ended, open to the future, and open to chance, hope must be disappointable to be hope. But that doesn't mean that for Bloch, that educated hope is just a daydream. Hope needs to have a plan, and it needs a theory. And it was this kind of hope that Angela Davis sought to find in joining the party. And even if it didn't work out as she wanted, this kind of willingness to risk and to fail, emphasized by Von Raspberry in his writing about Du Bois, is fundamental, after all, to revolutionary experience. You don't figure out what works unless you're willing to try it. In any case, I think the fundamental motive in Davis's actions, the effort to make possible and to join international collectives capable of fighting back against and defeating racist capitalism, remains as vital and as present as ever. The trick, it would seem, perhaps newly possible after this summer of uprisings against the police, is to find projects that translate across national context. Perhaps everybody hates the police. In Minsk, in Moscow, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Turkey, and in the US would be the slogan of this new movement. In any case, the old call of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers remains relevant. Dare to fight, dare to win, fight, fail, fight again, fail again, fight on to final victory. Thanks. That's it.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I know we can't really clap because it is this.
I know the whole Zoom thing is very weird.
But that was a deeply fascinating lecture. Excuse me, I'm tired. It's 5 p.m. You know, that's when the break.
It was also a story.
Also a story. This is true. So I think, right now I would like to take what time we have, and we're going a little bit over time, to take some questions. And if participants would want to enter some of their questions on the chat, I think that would probably be our best bet. And I also, while people do that, I want to take a moment and thank you for coming and joining us today. I know this had been planned a long time ago, but I also learned about the passing of Robert Byrd this week. And I saw your message about him, and thank you for, despite the grief that you are experiencing right now, for joining us and honoring, I think, his scholarly contributions in this way to talk about these topics that, as you mentioned, he also addressed in his work. I'm looking at the chat, which appears quiet unless I'm getting personal chats, which I'm not at this moment. I guess I'll ask you a little bit of a sort of general question, which is, as I said at the very outset, we don't talk about this kind of materials very often. What led you to this topic? And does it have anything to do with your own sort of, maybe, I think, comparatives, if I'm not mistaken, training? And could you talk a little bit about the process and the sort of exploration and how because you brought together so many of these sort of diverse materials, which I think is what's so compelling and fascinating about your topic. And Vaginal Davis is the best name ever.
Yeah, and she's an amazing intellect and performer as well. So Chief just made a new film, actually, which you can see, so that she's part of this collective. Yeah, I'm trained as a comparativist, right? And my two areas are like African American and Russian. So this has been my interest for a long time, and for a long time, when you tell people that that's what I work on or whatever, people are just, people are like, especially in Russia, it seemed hopelessly obscure. It was like, wow, you've chosen such a minor, tiny thing to focus on. But in the U.S. and in American studies context, it sort of made more sense, and I feel like that's where Kate Baldwin's book from like 2002 or 2003 or whatever, about sort of the color line and the Iron Curtain is a sort of crucial piece here. Obviously, very early on, I was very interested in, just all the Black people who went to the Soviet Union in the 1920s, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and the Soviet interest in anti-racism, which is really quite significant. And historically, historians have done fantastic work on this. Robin Kelly's book about communist organizing in Alabama, is a classic, The Hammer and the Hoe. And this comes after the 1928 meeting of the Communist International, right, where it's decided that the party is really that Black people in the U.S. are a revolutionary class, basically. What's the revolutionary class in the U.S.? It's Black people. And moreover, they're part of a revolutionary class internationally, right? So the Comintern also starts doing work in Africa at this moment and sponsors this journal called The Negro Worker, which sort of brings together all these different areas. So anyway, so I'm coming from this comparativist background, which sort of gets me interested in this. But my work, on this project in particular started, in part with my location in Detroit and getting interested in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers here. When I got to Detroit in 2003, a lot of the members of the League were still around, General Baker in particular. And so the League forms in 1968, right? And they're explicitly motivated by a reading of Lenin. And so, and it's Lenin on party formation. It's, and what is, Lenin on party formation is precisely takes up this question of how do you form collectives? And so I got interested in this, so I was like, oh, that's really interesting. In this moment, they're sort of trying to figure out how to form a Black collective, a Black revolutionary class in the factories of Detroit. They go back to Lenin, and that shapes how they, they appropriate Lenin, and they sort of, it's not so much about the influence of Lenin so much as the appropriation of ideas from Lenin into this African-American context. So anyway, so I got interested in how the League of Revolutionary Black Workers did their thing and the role of the newspaper in the work that they were doing, the sort of shop floor newspaper in creating a collective. And then I was like, oh, so where is, is there a sort of, what is this tradition of Black Leninism? What are its contours? So this is this sort of book project I'm working on now, which goes back to the 20s and kind of ends with Davis, with this moment in the early 70s. So that's this, anyway, I'm just rambling now, but that's the sort of trajectory of the project, so Du Bois is in there, Langston Hughes is in there, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers are in there, Gwendolyn Brooks is in there, Ralph Ellison is in there. And the interest really for me is, what is it that happens at this moment where a group that was maybe cynical, dispersed, depressed, wasn't capable of political action, what happens when it forms into a group that's capable of political action? And the Black Leninist tradition, I think, is very interested in aesthetic activity as a key, as playing a key role in that transition into a politically powerful collective.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your answer to my question. We have a couple more questions here on the chat. One is, you had mentioned portions of Angela Davis's narrative, including her inner perspective of compulsory welcome into the USSR. What is the source for this narrative?
The compulsory aspect might have been me. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is if you watch this film, which we couldn't watch all of, but it's a weird film. It's like a 25-minute film or something, but what she's doing is she's following a totally preordained path that's almost exactly the same tour that like Langston Hughes made in the early 1930s, going to these famous sites. At each one of these famous sites, she makes a speech about the Soviet Union being the leader of the battle against imperialism and the October Revolution as the first anti-imperialist revolution. And, she's reading from what was a very familiar script at that moment. And she's reading it in a way that is not, it seems discordant with her presentation in the US, where she's really sort of attacking the state and is not saying any pre-formulated anything, right? I mean, she's incredibly articulate and charismatic. So that's the compulsory thing that I'm talking about, right? She's sort of, in order to participate in these she's participating in these rituals of Soviet state power. And Yurchak, the anthropologist who sort of wrote the book about the transition, wrote a crucial book about the transition from the late Soviet period to the post-Soviet period, focuses a lot on these sort of Soviet rituals. And he argues that they sort of functioned rather complexly. People participated in them and were cynical about them and were cynical about the Soviet state, but that doesn't mean that they didn't nonetheless have effects. They had performative effects. They were practices that did things in the world. And even though they were cynical about the Soviet ideology, that also didn't mean that they didn't believe in socialism. And you kind of see this in Susanna's narrative, right? The reason she was, she didn't like Honecker was because they obviously weren't socialist, right? And she's like, Davis, who actually seems to be socialist, why is she coming to East Germany and supporting Honecker, who obviously isn't, especially after in the United States, she's an enemy of political prisoners and political repression, right? It seems totally discordant. So I think that's a sort of crucial part of how she's received at that moment in the Soviet Union, which is completely different in Cuba, for instance. It's a completely different reception there, a much more, a completely enthusiastic one.
Yeah, and I think we might, maybe in the next semester have some material on Cuba as well. I think that would be a really interesting topic for further consideration. I will read this last question I see on the chat, and then I myself will need to leave due to childcare, but Christina Benek will take over some of the chat functions on my behalf, and she's the Associate Director for CREASE. So the question here is, would love to hear more about the arc from Vaginal to Angela and how it would loop back to Vaginal, given your insights into Angela's activism. How does Angela Davis's failure to stand up to the regime that wants to functionalize war, as per Suzanne Sachi's memory, factor into Vaginal Davis's appropriation of her name? Does it? Or do you think that moment is ultimately subordinate to the project of forming collectives?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks, Johannes. So I don't think, at the moment when Vag appropriates her name, she's like a kid. and has seen this film, you know, and is just kind of amazed. And you know, Frederick Jameson has a useful phrase that was in a paragraph of the paper that I skipped over to you know, because of time. But he says, what from one side looks like utopia, from the other side is ideological. And he's sort of trying to narrate the different way that, you know, he's talking about the 90s, really, in the post-Soviet situation, and how the language of Marxism was sort of completely impossible in the former Soviet Union. But in this case of Angela Davis, I feel like it, you know, what looks like utopia from the U.S. side, right, for people who are opposed to racism and to capitalism, Angela Davis's being welcomed in the Soviet Union seems like amazing. And kind of impossible, right? It's this kind, you know, it's like, whoa, there's this sort of force fighting against racism that can sort of recognize Angela Davis for how amazing she is. Although it's, you know, it's, of course, it's interesting that Vag focuses precisely on this moment of a failure to perform the, you know, the correct role, and a failure that's kind of funny and exciting rather than like embarrassing or something. So I think there's a real mismatch between those two experiences, Susanna's experience and Vag's experience. Of course, Vag and Susanna are now together in an art collective. And what I was kind of trying to suggest at the end there was that even though the Soviet and East German experience of Davis's celebrity may have been ambivalent, it nonetheless left a powerful mark. And, you know, I don't know if this is true in East Germany, but in Russia now, if you're traveling, you know, whatever, last time I was in Russia, you know, you mentioned Angela Davis, people know who Angela Davis is, if they were alive during that period. And have some memory of her, of the fight to free, you know, it was one of these, you know, it was a very particular moment. So it leaves a mark that I think has can have unpredictable effects. I guess I would say it still resonates. So, you know, Susanna's sort of talking about her ambivalence, but her ambivalence about that past is also, I feel like, quite powerful for her, and you know, really gets at the weird way that state power works to sort of embarrass you about the political feelings that you have. But returning to that moment, Susanna's like, you know, now I would love to make flowers and roses for Angela. So I think that in retrospect, that experience that Susanna had about Angela Davis now actually is a point of connection with Vag, right? They both had these sort of earlier experiences with the figure of Angela Davis, which marked them powerfully in different ways, but nonetheless form a sort of point of connection. And I didn't get to say it, but I think that's one of the ways that fandom can actually, I don't think it itself does the work of political organizing, but I think it can form the basis of a common experience that then can be useful in political formation. And Angela Davis is an interesting instance of someone who's you know, is famous around the world, who's famous across these lines that are otherwise quite difficult to span. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's an interesting one, and that's sort of that's kind of what I still need to write, is sort of is bringing that back around.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your answer, Professor Flatley. I don't see any more questions. I see a message from Johanna saying, thanks, totally fabulous answer. If anyone would like to ask a question, please type it into the chat now. Let's just take a few minutes to give people a chance. But if there are no more questions, then we'd like to thank you very much, Professor Flatley, for being with us here and connecting with us. And then if I may just say when our next lecture would be, I think some of you might find it helpful. So on Thursday, September 17th, we'll host Professor Kimberly St. Julian Varnon from the University of Pennsylvania. And the title of her talk is Russia and Blackness, African American and African Experience in Soviet and Post-Soviet Russia. So this is what's happening in about 10 days or so. All right. Well, thank you again, and thank you everyone for coming, and I hope to see some of you on the 17th for the next installment.
Thanks, everybody. I just put in the chat, feel free to be in touch with me, you know, by email or whatever, and especially if you have helpful comments as I revise this. I will, I'll welcome those, you know, or critiques. You know, I'll be very happy to hear and entertain these as I'm, you know, like I'm working on this right now. So, you know, please do be in touch if you have any thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.